Welcome to your cell. You're gonna be here for 23 hours a day.
Solitary confinement has its roots in the colonial imprisonment system, but the form of solitary confinement known today was not truly developed until the 19th century. Prior to the 18th century, the concept of prison as a means of punishment did not really exist in Europe or the American colonies. Punishment instead came in the form of public shaming or execution. But as settlements in the colonial era expanded in size, crime increased as well, which pushed the need to develop a jail system.
The Quakers in Pennsylvania and West Jersey were among the first to advocate for substituting capital punishment for imprisonment, and are thus often credited for having laid out the foundations of the modern criminal justice system. They succeeded in building the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia in 1790, which was the first prison built in the U.S. There, the most serious criminals were kept in solitary confinement and only allowed a Bible.
Quakers believed that prisoners had to be given space to reflect on their actions and to seek forgiveness from God. It was thus in that prison that the first version of solitary confinement was born. Such concept was designed by the Quakers to punish and rehabilitate criminals, and although highly at unsuccessful rates, such concept proliferated over the years.
The high levels of immigration of the 19th century led to a significant population boom in the United States, which the prison system, lacking infrastructure and decency, was unable to keep up with. Thus, a push for new prisons started that led to the development of two different prison systems.
The first system was developed in 1821 and became known as the Auburn system. This system enforced strict silence and hard labor for its prisoners. Although requiring strict silence, the Auburn system permitted inmates to interact while at work. The second system that was developed was the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1829. In it, prisoners were kept entirely separate from each other and were kept in single cells. Inmates in this system spent close to 24 hours a day in their cells, and often time spent in their entire sentences in isolation.
The Quakers were the ones to initiate the development of these two prison systems out of religious intents, yet it instead drove many mad. On one occasion, shortly after the Auburn system was created, a breakdown took place that unsettled the general public. Nearly all of the 80 men who were placed in solitary confinement had mental breakdowns and committed suicide.
This raised awareness of the underlying problems regarding prisons in the United States, which led many to seek reform in the mid-19th century. For example, Dorothea Dix became a renowned reformer for the cause. Dix exposed many of the conditions in prisons after she toured the prisons in 1841. Despite the efforts of many, like Dorothea Dix, to improve the prison systems, harsh conditions did not stop proliferating.
In 1934, Alcatraz, one of the most notorious American prisons, was established. This prison primarily used solitary confinement as its means to control their prisoners. The solitary confinement units of this prison came to be nicknamed as the Hole by its inmates.
This name was rooted in the atrocious conditions they faced. They were placed in these singular cells with no clothes and were given very restricted diets. They faced pitch-black darkness for most of the day with no toilets or sink. Instead, there was a hole in the floor where the inmates could go to the bathroom, but they were only flushed a couple times a day under the control of the guards. But most shocking of all was that the general public was not made aware of this.
Even today, people are often unaware of how widespread solitary confinement is. There are more than 80,000 men, women, and children in solitary confinement in prisons across the United States. In addition, people of color are disproportionately represented in isolation units. Blacks represent 40% of solitary confinement prisoners, while Hispanics represent 46%. Solitary units are also disproportionately male, as women only make up about 7% of United States prisoners.
Such statistics illuminate the underlying problems of such an unethical system. Current-day conditions have since improved compared to the ones faced by Alcatraz inmates, but remain dehumanizing. Solitary confinement cells generally measure from 6 by 9 to 8 by 10 feet and are enclosed by a single solid metal door, although some have bars instead. Meals are provided to inmates through a slot in these doors, as do any communications with prison staff. They spend nearly 23 hours of their days in this cell and are allowed only about an hour of exercise a day. Exercise usually takes place alone in an exercise room.
The only other time they are allowed to leave their cell is to shower. Whenever a prisoner leaves his cell, he is escorted in shackles. They are, in addition, never granted visits or phone calls. Unlike other prisoners, inmates in solitary confinement are denied the opportunity to work or attend prison programming. They are banned from the use of televisions, radios, art supplies, reading materials, or anything we may consider as entertainment in their cells. Solitary inmates essentially live lives of total isolation.
To further aggravate the issue of such system, solitary confinement sentencing is rather unclear. People are not necessarily placed in solitary confinement because they have committed serious infractions. Instead, prisoners are often placed in the system after committing minor infractions once they have been placed in jail, like talking back to guards or getting caught with packs of cigarettes.
It is also common for prisoners to be placed in solitary for essentially no reason at all. Prisons use solitary confinement as a tool to manage gangs and isolate people they simply suspect have bad intents. People rarely receive a solitary confinement sentencing in court. Instead, it is the prisons themselves that decide who will be placed in solitary. This not only creates ambiguity, but it gives complete control to the prisons on how to treat their prisoners without giving them a say.
Uninformed people view solitary confinement as an effective way to rehabilitate prisoners, but studies have shown quite the opposite. There are numerous psychological effects associated with solitary confinement that prison officials often overlook. One study found that those in solitary develop psychopathologies at higher rates than those in the general prison population.
Prisoners in solitary confinement have also been found to engage in self-harm activities at higher rates than the general population. Once released, solitary inmates have a recidivism rate of 64%. Along with that, high prison suicide rates are largely associated to solitary. A 2007 study identified solitary confinement as a major factor of suicide attempts. To compound the problem, psychiatric resources are scarce in the overcrowded prison system.
An estimate of 20% of all inmates in the nation's prisons and jails are seriously mentally ill. Furthermore, behavior that stems from mental illness is often used as justification to place mentally ill inmates in isolation units, thus creating a never-ending cycle.
Despite being an introvert, I always liked the city. If I wanted Vietnamese food at 3 a.m., well, I like to have options. Some aspects of cities still interest me, but I know without a doubt that if I were to be released tomorrow, I couldn't live around people. I've been forced to exist compressed into this tiny little space with a bunch of degenerates far too many years. I need space and quiet. Silence. Real silence.
There are also economic problems associated with solitary confinement, as it is a very expensive practice. It costs about $78,000 to keep a single prisoner in federal solitary confinement, in comparison to the $22,000 to house a person who is not in solitary. This cost can be attributed to the fact that solitary units are much more expensive to construct and maintain. Since solitary inmates have to be escorted everywhere by 2 or more officers who are required to be paid, the costs are also higher. While taxpayers can offset some of these costs, it is not nearly enough.
At this point, he just wants to die. He feels like he's never going to get out. They keep adding time. Every time he does something wrong, the bill adds up, and adds up.
You're We're going to see a man feel the rain on his face for the first time in nearly 30 years. You'll also see him learn how to use Instagram and the ATM. Why? Because he was just released from death row in a case that raises serious questions about race, class, and America's justice system. For our new Nightline series, Firsts, here's my co-anchor, Byron Pitts.
For 30 years, Anthony Ray Hinton was a dead man walking.
Thank you, Devo. Thank you, Lord.
But not now. Family prayers answered, a dream no longer deferred.
Albert Woodfox is a man that did not experience the same success as Anthony Hinton. After 43 years in solitary, Woodfox was released with nearly no assistance to adjust back to society. His chance of acquiring a job and re-establishing himself are extremely slim, if not impossible.
Woodfox represents what happens to nearly all the inmates that are abruptly released from solitary. Inside prison, there are no education classes or job trainings offered to inmates in solitary when approaching their release. Solitary inmates also get no supervision once released. In Texas, for example, only 14% of inmates in the general prison population are released without supervision, but for those in solitary, the number increases to 63%. These individuals go from complete isolation one day to complete freedom the next, and are extremely ill-equipped for it. Such system almost guarantees unemployment and, more often than not, homelessness for these inmates.
Some attempts have been made in recent years to address this unethical system, but all faced limited success. The severe mental pains associated with solitary became classified as a form of torture by the United Nations, and in 2011, the United Nations Committee Against Torture called on all countries to ban solitary confinement of prisoners. According to Juan E. Mendez, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Segregation, Isolation, Separation, Cellular, Lockdown, Supermax, the Whole, Secure Housing Unit, whatever the name, solitary confinement should be banned by states as a punishment or extortion technique.
Despite this fact, the United Nations released a 15-page report on November 18, 2014, stating that the United States had not yet complied with their UN's decision to ban solitary confinement across the world. The report furthermore exposed excessive use of solitary confinement in the U.S. prisons and recommended a set of immediate, dramatic reforms to address such issue. The United States has done little to address the widespread practice of solitary across its prisons and remains the nation that uses solitary confinement most extensively in the world.
In 2016, Obama did attempt to improve such issue by banning solitary confinement for juveniles. It is now illegal to place minors in solitary, but this did nothing to help the thousands of adults that remain in this system today. After Obama's measure, it was said that some states, like Colorado or New Mexico, were going to attempt to rethink this practice and reduce the number of inmates in solitary, but nothing has yet to be implemented.
The government should take a more active role in reforming this system. In place of solitary confinement, a higher focus on rehabilitation should be given to inmates in order to effectively help them rather than tearing them apart. An emphasis on reintegration should also be offered to inmates re-entering society in order to allow for a smoother transition.
But improvement truly begins with the public. It is only when the public is invested into an issue that it gains support. Thus, more awareness should be raised about the atrocious conditions found in solitary confinement.